Where should we be in our Thunder Bay? We talk with John Pateman from the Thunder Bay Public Library about the new Thunder Bay that could emerge post COVID-19. It's Monday, and it's James with Net News Ledger. Joining me by Zoom is John Pateman from the Thunder Bay Public Library. We've been having a series of discussions on where the emerging new Thunder Bay should be. But first, John, welcome back.
Hi, James. Good to be here.
It's Monday. We're still in lockdown. I'm going to guess that everything is pretty much as it has been at the Thunder Bay Public Library for access.
Yes, indeed. We just heard, of course, that the stay-at-home order has been extended until June the 2nd, and therefore we are still in the holding pattern that I've been talking about for some time now. But just a reminder what that is that three of our libraries, which is Waverley, Brodie, and Mary J. L. Black, are open for curbside pickup only, and there is no service at County Fair Mall because it's in a mall setting. However, many of our services are now available online 24/7, whether that's programming, ebooks, free online resources, and those can be accessed at any time.
I suppose the good news here is that with the numbers that we're getting in Thunder Bay, I mean, today was 3 cases. They were reporting another 5 or 6 cases with variants of concern. But that's over a period of time, and they've investigated them. Once we hit June 2nd, we could be in what used to be the green zone. We could be opening up fully.
We could be, though. I also hear the kind of the benchmark that's been set across the whole province is that cases have got to get down under 1,000 and stay down under 1,000 for a period of time. They're still coming in over 2,000 at the moment. So whether that will be achieved by June the 2nd, who knows? And also, we haven't heard yet if there's going to be any adjustments to that color-coded provincial framework, whether there's going to, whether the definitions of each of those stages of reopening are going to change. So as ever, we're waiting for further news so we can plan accordingly.
Now, as we're playing that waiting game, I think maybe what we could do is let's play a bit of a game that if we were in one of the voyageur canoes coming in to this area for the very first time, only we found the city of Thunder Bay here. And we were coming in and we were going to reinvent this city and start it from a new direction. What kind of things we would do? And, one of the thoughts that I've had, John, and it comes out of something that was discussed a lot in Alberta once upon a time, was that doctors should be paid a huge amount of money. 20 years ago, they were talking about pay doctors $1 million a year. But every time they see a patient for an illness, it comes off that $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that what it meant was that doctors are no longer going to be treating illnesses, but the doctor's primary business should be treating wellness and creating a healthier society. And maybe that's something that could be done here in Thunder Bay.
Yeah, I've always been a great believer in prevention is better than cure. And also prevention is often cheaper than cure because you get to the problem before it becomes a problem. And of course, I can only speak from my experience of public libraries. But public libraries are a great preventative service because the kind of things we offer people, all of which is free, are things that can prevent problems happening in the first place. I think then if we kind of extend that analogy and we look at institutions that are more here to do the curing piece, and we start a conversation about how can they transform from being cure-led to preventative-led, and dare I say it, could we then think about transferring some funding maybe from some institutions to other institutions, depending on what their focus is? Then I think we could kind of as you suggest, reimagine and kind of reset the whole scenario, because as we know, you keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting change, and that's the definition of madness. But I must also say, James, when you kind of introduce that notion of the voyageurs arriving, I think we can learn a lot from our Indigenous folks, because what my knowledge of how Indigenous society worked before the settlers arrived was they had highly democratic societies, for example, where everybody had a say in what happened. It wasn't all through some hierarchy of power. It was a more shared model. The role of women was very different as well. The notion of ownership of land didn't exist. So sometimes going back to those ideas could maybe give us some solutions for today.
I remember the first time that Net News Ledger was live streaming the Lakehead University Native Student Association Lunsa Powwow. I ended up talking to Jim Peters, Chicago. And I was my first time really at a powwow like that. It was an educational powwow. We were live streaming it with permission from the elder, who could have said no, but he thought it would be a neat idea as long as we didn't, any of the prayer songs he did not want live streamed. So we built up a signal. But I asked Jim, the drum, what's the importance of the drum? And he said, when we just had the drum, we didn't need psychologists. We didn't need social workers. We took things to the heartbeat of Mother Earth and we lived a better life. And so, yes, I think that you've got a good point there in how this can be done. And
I think we've kind of complicated things. I think the notion of modernization and civilization is to make things complicated, have lots of experts, that kind of thing. But I would say, kind of, where has that kind of got us? Maybe we need to return to a more simple way of doing things. And that's not to say, a lower level of doing things. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying a simplified form of democracy, for example, whereby everybody feels they've got a stake in the city, everybody's got a say in the city, again, might be a good way forward, because we need the conversation to happen. But once the conversations happen and we've come up with solutions, then we need the major institutions in the city to then change quite significantly, perhaps, in order to make that new reality actually work. Because again, having ideas is great, but if nothing changes within the institutions, then things go on as normal.
That's one that I've found. They had the city brought in an expert in youth centers from Youth Centers Canada. He looked around the city because at that time we were having the horrific number of deaths of students from Dennis Franklin Camardi, Kids in the River. Seven Fallen Feathers hadn't been written yet, but Seven Fallen Feathers was happening. And he basically said that what we have here is all the resources we need, but they're all in silos working apart from each other, and in fact being forced to fight each other for funding. Mm-hmm. The city of Thunder Bay at that point had done a survey amongst citizens, and for 2 years in a row, the top item on that survey was that we need youth centers. And in that time, we have built a $500 million courthouse. We had a youth center pilot project that ran for a year with city help, and then they managed to keep it going for another year, and it ended. And so they've got the pilot project done. They know what they need to do. At one point where Wacky's Wings was, they were looking at putting a youth center in that building, and it never happened. I've watched tremendous change. What I think, and I'm not trying to blow smoke up your anything, John, but I've noticed a tremendous change in the past years with the Thunder Bay Public Library.
So that's a great example, James, because apart from schools, which you'd expect, because they're designed for children and young people, the other place in Thunder Bay used most by children and young people is Thunder Bay Public Library by far, right? By far, that we are the next on the list after schools. So if we were going to start planning out some kind of youth strategy, youth club or youth centre approach, why not start at the public library? And I don't say that with any kind of ego or arrogance. It's just the fact is we have so many young people using us already. So say, for example, we were a public library during the day and a youth centre or a youth club in the evening. How about that? We get better use of our investment in our resources, in our infrastructure. We've already got a lot of things there. We've got auditoriums, we've got equipment, we've obviously got books. That could be a way of looking at this, rather than, which is kind of the normal way, as you say, through a more siloed approach. You say, let's build standalone youth centres. Well, that's very expensive. It needs a whole new set of staff and infrastructure. Why not look at where youth are already going and see how we can grow that piece?
Now, if something like that were to start, I would bet that the public library would say, let's partner with the Multicultural Youth Council with Moffat Makuto. I'll bet you they'd be saying, hey, let's work with Peter Panetta and the underground gym. And maybe what needs to happen is more of that, working together approach. And, I know when the process of Youth Centers Canada came here and made a suggestion on youth centers and the pilot project started, the city got the immediate first steps was, okay, what's the law we're going to have to follow? And that led to a lot of hoops and bureaucracy and everything else. And I think I see that, sometimes in what the underground gym has been trying to do, which has now become a citizen-funded youth center here in the city, waiting for COVID to end and move forward after it's, with new facilities, a new building and everything else. So there's opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, and as you're right, I mean, I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. People like Moffat and Peter are my community heroes because I see them making a real change to young people's lives in the city. And the reason why I would, talk to them first is they are youth-led. They are young people focused. They're not institution-led or buildings-led. It's all about the youth and what's best for the youth. They kind of think outside the institutional box and the silo thinking that you talked about earlier. So and we're already working with them on other projects, but to scale the whole thing up, to kind of move it beyond that conversation is again part of this reset, reimagine piece.
And, if you reimagine the issue with crime, I'm often taken back to Sir Robert Peel and the 7 principles or the principles of modern policing, which were that the biggest thing the police can do is to be there of the people and for the people, not necessarily like a show of force is not seen under his rules as a success. And for our readers and listeners who don't know, I mean, Robert Peel, that's why the police in London are called Bobbies, from Robert to Bobby to that's what the police are. And when they, you think of the image in the past where the police they had their no gun. They were there not to enforce the law, but to make things better. And, sometimes I think we move into this process, and you see it, especially in the United States, primarily, where you end up with a police force instead of a police service. And it's a real change in attitude when if I'm going to be a force for good or I'm going to serve the community.
Yeah, and I think, James, there is a lot of learning still coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, which, as we know, kind of became very big last summer and triggered one of the biggest public demonstrations in the city's history. And some of the thinking coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement around how police forces are funded, how that funding model can change, I think has got resonance in every community. I always think we need to talk to the people who are closest to this problem, which is those that are impacted most by whatever the issue is. And crime, as we know, is mostly something that happens in poorer communities. It impacts marginalized, disadvantaged, racialized people more. So that's really where the conversation needs to start. And we can see, well, what is wrong with the current model? Let's understand that properly. And then what are these alternative solutions? And again, if we look around, you mentioned a great example earlier around healthcare, how that can be done differently. There are alternative police strategies as well that have been evaluated and which are more effective than the police force, as you put it, and the whole curative approach.
And now this is where I think the pandemic and from talking late last week, I had an interview with Todd Doherty, who's a Conservative member of Parliament from Prince George, Caribou riding, and he'd put together a bill that actually passed the House of Commons coming from the opposition. And that doesn't happen that often, but he's advocating for a national 988 national suicide prevention helpline. And the Commons passed it. It's now moving to law, but it's stuck in the bureaucracy of the Canadian Radio Television Commission. They're trying to figure out how to make this happen. Well, to me, we have 211, we have 411, we have 911. Now, if we're going to have 988, they're not having to reinvent a wheel. So why is it taking, it's been 180 days so far of bureaucrats studying this, and the politicians are starting to get frustrated with the bureaucrats. On the other end, the bureaucrats are probably almost a lot of them are working from home. So how much work is getting done like it could be because they don't have the full tools maybe that they'd have sitting in their offices?
Yeah, I think also there's a big kind of difference between taking a strategic decision, which is what politicians do, and then making that into an operational system, which is what the bureaucrats do. The problem I see though is that the gap between the two can mean that the thing either never happens, or it happens in a much more limited way. And I think that the way to make these things a success is focus on what is the really big number one reason why we're doing this. In this case, obviously, it's to reduce suicides or whatever the issue is. But what often happens is everybody looks at all the 101 reasons for not doing something, because it's going to mean this, it's going to mean that, it's going to mean more money, or it's going to mean change of some sort. And it's this kind of resistance to change that ultimately undermines most progressive ideas. Which is why, again, we need to reset, reimagine, use COVID-19 as that opportunity to say, well, we don't want to go back to that status quo. That status quo didn't serve us well at all. As a whole community, and parts of the community in particular, it did not serve. So why on earth would we ever want to go back to that? And let's hope that our experience of this over the last 18 months or so is going to lead us into these conversations.
And that's the one, John, where we're going to start opening this up and getting another guest in and another guest and start making these discussions a little bit wider. Because I think the key right now is that there is an appetite for change across the city at, call it the grassroots level. Perhaps at the bureaucratic level, the biggest process in bureaucracy for the civil servant, the bureaucrat, is the maintenance of the almighty bureaucracy. And they sometimes forget that the bureaucracy was created not to be the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy was created to help people.
Correct. But the way, as you say, these things get interpreted, they become enshrined in law and bylaw and rules and regulations. And one of the things we've done at the library is recognize that isn't always a helpful approach. In fact, it's very rarely a helpful approach. It's better to loosen all of those things, to have more room for maneuver, more room for discretion, more room for initiative, to allow new ideas to grow. And that means loosening up the whole system. I mean, I can see from a risk management point of view why a bureaucrat would want to nail everything down to the nth degree, because then nothing can go wrong, in theory, at least. But you've got to look at what are you trying to achieve here? What are the outcomes you're looking at? And not be so fixated on the process. It shouldn't be so process driven. We need to be outcome driven. But to know what those outcomes are in the first place, we need to have the big conversation to understand fully what it is we're aiming at.
I will bet you have librarians come into the system today who had worked and retired from the public library in the 1950s or the 1940s. They'd come into the 2020s library and be shocked. It's not this place to just sit there quietly and read or get a book and leave. It's
yeah, I mean, public libraries, and we're no exception, are always on a journey. We're always trying to keep up or ahead of change. But I may have mentioned before, this city has always had what I would call a radical, leading edge public library. It's not just been under my leadership. And Mary J. L. Black, who was a pioneering Canadian public librarian, started that process off back in the 20s and 30s. And it was driven by the kind of city that we're in, the blue collar, unionized environment we're in, with dynamic cultural community kind of currents as well. All of that kind of energy. If you focus all that through the public library, that's when the kind of change we've been talking about becomes possible.
And so that's the goal as we talk forward. And I think we'll leave it there for this week, John. Change is what's possible.
Yes, and be the change you want to see. That's all. That's my mantra.
And we will talk to you on Monday.
See you then.
Thank you. Now, a second here. To keep up to date, you have to subscribe. You have to hit that like button and hit the notification to stay in touch.